Sometimes life forces us to leave everything familiar behind and discover who we truly are. Sometimes the most unexpected encounters change the course of our entire existence. In 1847 Colorado Territory, Boston heiress Beatrice Langford steps off her father's stagecoach, expecting to find empty wilderness. Instead, she meets Silas McGraw, a legendary mountain man whose size and strength are whispered about in every frontier town. When outlaws threaten her father's land, Beatrice must trust this imposing stranger who lives by wilderness law. Together, they face dangers that will test everything they thought they knew about courage, survival, and love. Can a pampered city, woman, and the territory's most feared mountain man forge a bond strong enough to survive the untamed frontier? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, carried by a messenger whose mud-stained boots left marks across the polished marble of Beatrice Langford's Beacon Hill foyer. She'd been arranging white orchids in her mother's crystal vase when Mrs. Hensworth, the housekeeper, appeared with the sealed envelope that would change everything. "From Colorado Territory, Miss," Mrs. Hensworth said, her voice carrying the weight of foreboding that servants develop when they've witnessed too many family dramas unfold in grand houses. Beatrice's hands trembled as she broke the wax seal. The formal script informed her that her father, whom she hadn't spoken to in 3 years following their bitter argument about her refusal to marry the banker he'd chosen, had died of pneumonia in a place called Rocky Creek. More shocking still, he had left her his entire western holdings, thousands of acres of Colorado wilderness she'd never seen, along with mining claims and grazing rights that the lawyer's letter suggested might be worth a considerable fortune. The delicate cameo brooch at her throat, her mother's final gift before consumption, claimed her 5 years earlier, caught the morning light as she sank into the velvet armchair by the window. The same brooch had adorned 3 generations of Langford women, each one living lives of quiet refinement within the boundaries society had drawn for them. But as Beatrice read the letter again, she felt something stirring within her that had nothing to do with propriety or expectation. Her father had been a complicated man, brilliant in business, cold in affection, driven by ambitions that had taken him west in search of opportunities that Boston's established wealth couldn't satisfy. She remembered him as a figure who filled doorways with his presence, spoke of manifest destiny with the fervor of a preacher, and dreamed of taming wilderness that others found too daunting to attempt. Their final argument had centered on her declaration that she would choose her own path, her own husband, her own life. He had called her foolish and naive. She had called him controlling and heartless. Now, 3 years of silence stretched between them, ended only by his death and this unexpected inheritance. Within a week, Beatrice had made arrangements that scandalized Boston society. She liquidated her mother's jewelry collection, hired guides and guards for the journey west, and arranged for her prized stallion Thunder to accompany her to Colorado Territory. Thunder was a magnificent black thoroughbred her. Father had given her for her 18th birthday, one of the few gestures of affection she could remember from him. The horse was her pride, standing 16 hands high with a spirit that matched her own stubborn independence. The stagecoach journey took 3 weeks of bone-jarring travel across increasingly wild terrain. As the familiar landscapes of her childhood faded behind her, Beatrice felt both terrified and exhilarated. The other passengers, a circuit preacher named Reverend Matthews, a traveling salesman called Murphy, and a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Caldwell, who was journeying to meet her homesteader son, treated her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "A young lady traveling alone to such rough country," Mrs. Caldwell observed on their second day out from Independence, Missouri. "It's not natural, miss. Not safe." Reverend Matthews nodded gravely. "The frontier changes people, child. Sometimes, not for the better." But Murphy, whose weathered face spoke of years spent on dangerous roads, offered different counsel. "Territory's got opportunity for them brave enough to take it," he said, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of jerky. "Your father, he was one of the smart ones. Got in early, claimed the best land before others knew its worth." As they rolled deeper into Colorado territory, the landscape transformed from rolling plains to jagged mountains that seemed to scrape the belly of the sky. Beatrice had never seen anything so vast or untamed. Mile after mile of wilderness stretched in every direction, broken only by game trails and the occasional distant wisp of smoke from a settler's cabin or Indian camp. The air grew thinner and cleaner, carrying scents of pine, sage, and something wild and indefinable that made her pulse quicken. At night, when they stopped at way stations or camped beneath stars more brilliant than any she'd ever seen in Boston, she could hear the calls of creatures she couldn't identify. Wolves, perhaps, or mountain cats. The sounds should have frightened her, but instead they stirred something restless in her spirit. Thunder rode behind the stagecoach, his lead rope tied to the rear axle, and she often watched him through the small back window. The stallion seemed to be adapting to the journey better than she was, his head held high as he took in the strange new world with the same curiosity she felt. On their final day of travel before reaching Rocky Creek, their guide, a grizzled man named Jeremiah, who spoke in grunts and gesture more than words, pointed toward a massive peak in the distance. "That there's Grizzly Mountain," he said. "Got its name from the man who lives up there, Silas McGraw. Folks call him Grizzly on account of his size and the way he can wrestle bears. Some say he's more animal than man now, been living alone up there for nigh on 8 years. Mrs. Caldwell shuddered. "Surely that's just frontier tall tales." Jeremiah shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am, seen him myself once. Biggest man I ever laid eyes on. Near 7 feet tall and broad as a barn door, but they say he's got the education of a gentleman, talks like he came from back east like you folks. Strange combination, book learning and wilderness living." "What made him choose such isolation?" Beatrice asked, surprised by her own curiosity about this mountain hermit. "Nobody knows for certain," Jeremiah replied. "Some say he lost a woman. Others claim he was running from the law. Most figure he just got tired of civilization and its complications." As they approached Rocky Creek, Beatrice could see why her father had been drawn to this place. The town sat in a natural bowl, surrounded by towering peaks, with a crystal-clear stream running right through its center. Buildings were mostly log construction, practical and sturdy rather than elegant, but there was something appealing about their honest simplicity. The territorial bank manager, a thin man named Harrison, who wore spectacles and nervous perspiration, met her at the stagecoach depot. "Miss Langford," he said, removing his hat and offering a slight bow. "I'm terribly sorry about your father's passing. He was a respected man in these parts." As Harrison led her through the dusty main street toward the boarding house where she would spend her first night, Beatrice noticed how people stopped their conversations to stare at her. Her traveling dress, though practical by Boston standards, marked her as an outsider as clearly as if she wore a sign. The women wore simple calico or wool, their hands showing the evidence of hard work. The men dressed in leather and rough cloth, many carrying firearms as casually as they might carry pocket watches back home. "Your father's holdings are extensive," Harrison explained as they walked. "Grazing land, timber rights, and several mining claims. The surveys suggest there might be silver deposits, though that hasn't been confirmed. There's also been some trouble lately." "What kind of trouble?" Harrison glanced around nervously before answering. "Outlaws. A gang, led by a man called Blackjack Morrison, has been threatening landowners, demanding protection money. Some folks have already sold out rather than fight. Your father, well, he was the kind of man who didn't back down from threats." That evening, in her small but clean room above the general store, Beatrice examined the documents Harrison had given her. Maps showed property lines encompassing thousands of acres of mountain and valley land. Mining assay reports suggested the possibility of significant mineral wealth, and there were letters, dozens of them from her father, written but never sent, each one an attempt to bridge the gap their argument had created. She read until her candle burned low, tears blurring her vision as she realized how much her father had wanted to reconcile. In his final unsent letter, dated just 2 weeks before his death, he had written, "My dearest Beatrice, I was wrong to try to choose your path for you. I hope someday you'll find it in your heart to forgive a stubborn old man who loved you more than he knew how to show." Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of endless mountains and the sound of her father's voice calling her name across distances that could never be crossed. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Harrison arrived at dawn, with Jim Bauer, a weathered rancher who served as the unofficial leader of the local landowners association. "Miss Langford," Bauer said without preamble, "Blackjack Morrison's gang hit the Hendricks place last night, burned the barn, killed their livestock, left a message saying any landowner who doesn't pay tribute by month's end will face the same." Harrison wrung his hands. "Perhaps you should consider selling, miss. This is no place for a woman alone." But as Beatrice looked out the window at the magnificent wilderness her father had claimed, she felt that same stirring in her spirit she'd experienced during the journey west. The cameo brooch at her throat seemed to warm against her skin, as if her mother's presence was encouraging her to be brave. "No," she said quietly, "I'm not running. This land is mine now, and I'll see what it has to offer." Neither man could know that within hours she would encounter the legendary mountain man whose reputation had already captured her imagination, or that her simple declaration of intent would set in motion events that would transform not just her own life, but the entire territory around Rocky Creek. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Beatrice rode Thunder toward the northern boundary of her father's land. Harrison had provided her with a rough map and warned her against traveling alone, but she needed to see the property for herself to understand what her father had seen in this wild country. Thunder moved with eager confidence beneath her, his hooves finding sure footing on the rocky trail that wound up from the valley floor. The stallion seemed to thrive in the mountain air, his coat gleaming black as obsidian in the crisp sunlight. Beatrice had dressed practically in a split riding skirt and sturdy boots, though she still felt conspicuously civilized in the vast wilderness. The trail led through stands of towering pine and aspen, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the light into dancing patterns on the forest floor. She paused frequently to consult her father's map, trying to match the landmarks he had sketched with the reality before her. A distinctive rock formation here, a creek junction there. Slowly, the abstract lines on paper began to make sense of the territory around her. It was near midday when she heard the sound of wood being split with methodical precision. The sharp crack of axe meeting log echoed through the trees, followed by the thud of split pieces hitting the ground. Curious, she guided Thunder toward the sound, following a narrow game trail that wound between massive boulders. The clearing opened suddenly before her, and Beatrice pulled Thunder to an abrupt stop, her breath catching in her throat. Before her stood a man unlike any she had ever seen. He was enormous, easily the tallest human being she had ever encountered, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun behind him. His hair was dark brown and fell to his shoulders, and a full beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore simple buckskin trousers and a homespun shirt that strained across his massive frame. But it was his hands that captured her attention first, not because of their size, though they were indeed huge, but because of their obvious skill and care. In them he held a hand-carved walking stick, its surface smooth and polished, decorated with intricate designs that spoke of patience and artistry. The stick was clearly functional, meant for navigating rough terrain, but it was also beautiful, a work of craftsmanship that revealed depth she hadn't expected from the wild mountain man of local legend. The man looked up at her approach, and Beatrice found herself staring into eyes of remarkable intelligence and warmth. They were grey-green, like storm clouds over a deep forest, and they regarded her with curiosity rather than the hostility she might have expected from a hermit disturbed in his solitude. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Beatrice was acutely aware of thunder shifting restlessly beneath her, the stallion sensing her tension. The man set down his walking stick carefully and straightened to his full height, which she now realized was truly extraordinary. "You're bigger than my horse." The words escaped her before she could stop them, her voice carrying a mixture of amazement and nervous laughter. She immediately felt foolish for the outburst, expecting the mountain man to respond with grunts or suspicious glares, as frontier legends suggested such men were wont to do. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, a hint of amusement flickering in those remarkable eyes. "That's quite a compliment to both of us, I imagine," he said, his voice a deep bass that seemed to resonate from somewhere in his massive chest. "Your stallion there is a magnificent animal, 16 hands, if I'm any judge, with the lines of thoroughbred breeding. For you to suggest I measure favorably against such a creature is indeed flattering." Beatrice blinked in astonishment. The man spoke with the educated diction of a gentleman, his words chosen with care and delivered with obvious intelligence. This was not the grunting savage she had been led to expect. "I apologize," she said, finding her manners despite her confusion. "That was terribly rude of me. I'm Beatrice Langford." "Silas McGraw," he replied with a slight nod, "and no apology is necessary. I imagine my appearance is rather startling to someone accustomed to more civilized company." He moved with surprising grace for such a large man, stepping closer to examine Thunder with the practiced eye of someone who understood horses. The stallion, usually skittish around strangers, allowed the approach with unusual calm. "You've ridden him hard," Silas observed, noting the slight lather on Thunder's neck. "The mountain trails can be treacherous for animals not accustomed to the terrain. Beautiful as he is, he's built for speed on level ground, not for rock climbing." "I'm exploring my father's land," Beatrice explained. "Thomas Langford's holdings. I inherited them recently." Something shifted in Silas's expression, a shadow crossing his features. "Thomas Langford. I heard about his passing. My condolences. He was a good man, though we didn't speak often. You knew my father?" "Our paths crossed occasionally. He sometimes hired me to guide hunting parties or survey difficult terrain. He spoke of having a daughter back east, though I gathered there had been some estrangement." Beatrice felt heat rise in her cheeks. Even here in the wilderness, her family's private failures were apparently common knowledge. "We had our differences," she said carefully. Silas nodded, understanding more than she had revealed. "Families often do. He was proud of you, though. Said you had spirit and intelligence that reminded him of your mother." Before Beatrice could respond to this unexpected insight into her father's feelings, the peaceful morning was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, many of them moving fast through the forest below. Silas's demeanor changed instantly, his relaxed posture shifting to alert wariness. "How many people knew you were riding out here today?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "The bank manager, Harrison. The boarding house proprietor. I mentioned it to several people in town." Even as she spoke, Beatrice realized how naive she had been. Silas moved quickly to his cabin, emerging with a rifle that looked well-maintained and frequently used. "Miss Langford, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Those riders aren't coming to pay social calls. From the sound, I'd guess 6 or 7 men, and they're riding hard with purpose." The hoofbeats were growing closer, and now Beatrice could hear voices, rough masculine voices calling out commands she couldn't quite make out. "Blackjack Morrison," she whispered, remembering Harrison's warnings. "Most likely," Silas confirmed grimly. "Your father refused to pay their tribute. Now they'll expect the same from you, with interest." "What do we do?" Silas was already moving, gathering essential supplies with the efficiency of long practice. "We get you away from here. My cabin's defensible, but not against those numbers. And Thunder, magnificent as he is, will be a liability on the mountain trails if we need to move fast." As if summoned by their conversation, the riders burst into the clearing. 7 men on horseback, all armed, led by a figure whose black clothing and silver-adorned saddle marked him unmistakably as the infamous Black Jack Morrison. He was a lean man with cruel eyes and a smile that promised violence. "Well, well," Black Jack called out, his gaze moving between Beatrice and Silas. "The little Eastern princess and the mountain hermit. How convenient to find you both in one place." Silas stepped protectively in front of Beatrice, though she remained mounted on Thunder. "Morrison, you're trespassing on private land." "Private land?" Blackjack laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The only law out here is what a man can enforce with his gun, and I've got 7 guns to your 1. What do you want?" Beatrice asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Smart girl. Straight to business." Blackjack's eyes glittered with avarice. "Your daddy owed me a considerable sum for protection services. Now that debt passes to you. $5,000 plus interest. Call it 6,000, and I'll let you keep operating your little mining claims." The sum was staggering, more than many people saw in a lifetime. But as Beatrice looked at the faces of Blackjack's men, hard, merciless, faces that spoke of violence as casual as breathing, she realized that payment would only delay the inevitable. "And if I refuse," Blackjack's smile widened, "then you'll join your daddy in the ground and I'll take the land anyway. Though I might keep you alive long enough to sample some of that Eastern refinement first." The crude threat sent fury blazing through Beatrice's veins, but before she could respond, Silas spoke with quiet authority. "That's not going to happen, Morrison." "1 man against 7? Blackjack scoffed. "Even the great grizzly McGraw isn't that good." But Silas had already raised his rifle, and something in his stance suggested he was far more dangerous than even his reputation indicated. The outlaws shifted nervously in their saddles, suddenly less confident. "Miss Langford," Silas said without taking his eyes off the gang, "when I give the word, you ride Thunder straight up that trail behind us. Don't look back. Don't stop until you reach town. I'm not leaving you. You are." His voice brooked no argument. "This isn't about heroics. It's about survival." The tension in the clearing stretched like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. Beatrice could feel Thunder trembling beneath her, the stallion sensing the violence that hung in the air like an approaching storm. Then Blackjack made his mistake. With a cruel laugh, he spurred his horse forward, apparently intending to grab Thunder's reins and take control of the situation. But he had underestimated both the stallion's spirit and Silas McGraw's reflexes. Thunder reared, his hooves flashing dangerously close to Blackjack's head, while simultaneously Silas's rifle cracked like thunder in the mountain air. One of the outlaws cried out and toppled from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. "Now!" Silas shouted. Beatrice dug her heels into Thunder's sides, and the stallion launched himself up the mountain trail with the speed and power that had made him famous among Boston's horse fanciers. Behind her, she heard more gunshots and shouts, but she followed Silas's instructions and didn't look back. The trail was treacherous, winding between boulders and over loose scree that could easily cause a horse to stumble and fall. But Thunder seemed to have found his element in the mountain terrain, his powerful haunches driving him upward with surprising agility. When she finally allowed herself to glance over her shoulder, the clearing was far below and hidden by trees. But the sound of gunfire had stopped, and that silence terrified her more than the violence had. Silas McGraw, if he still lived, was now her only hope of survival in a wilderness that had suddenly become as dangerous as it was beautiful. And she was entirely dependent on a man she had met less than an hour ago, whose reputation was built on legends that might or might not be true. As Thunder carried her higher into the mountains, toward an uncertain fate, Beatrice realized that her old life was truly over. Whatever happened next, she would never again be the sheltered Boston heiress who had stepped off that stagecoach just days ago. The frontier had claimed her now, for better or worse. 3 hours passed before Beatrice heard the whistle, Two short, sharp notes that seemed to come from the wind itself. She had been riding Thunder along increasingly narrow mountain paths, her heart hammering with fear for Silas's fate and uncertainty about her own. The stallion was breathing hard from the altitude and the difficult terrain, and she knew they couldn't continue much longer without rest. The whistle came again, and this time she recognized it as a human signal. Her hand moved instinctively to the small riding crop at her side, a poor weapon, but the only one she carried. Then she heard Silas's voice calling her name from somewhere below the trail. "Miss Langford, it's safe to stop now." She pulled Thunder to a halt on a small plateau that offered a view of the valley below. Moments later, Silas emerged from the tree line, moving with the quiet efficiency she was beginning to associate with him. He was on foot, she noticed, and there was a tear in his shirt sleeve, though he didn't appear to be seriously injured. "Where's your horse?" she asked as he approached. "I don't keep one," he replied, settling his walking stick against a nearby boulder. "Horses require too much care and attention for a man living alone. I travel on foot." Beatrice stared at him in amazement. "You mean you followed us up this mountain on foot? For 3 hours?" A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Mountain living teaches you to move efficiently, and you were breaking trail for me. Thunder's hoof prints are easy to follow." She dismounted, her legs unsteady after the long, tense ride. "What happened back there?" "I heard gunshots. Morrison and his men are no longer a concern for today," Silas said carefully, "but they'll be back, probably with more men. Word travels fast in outlaw circles when someone stands up to Blackjack Morrison, the way he avoided." Specifics about the confrontation told Beatrice everything she needed to know about what had happened in that clearing. She found herself studying this remarkable man with new eyes, seeing past his size to the controlled competence that made him far more dangerous than his hermit reputation suggested. "I should return to town," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Inform the authorities." "What authorities?" Silas asked gently. "The nearest federal marshal is 3 days' ride away, assuming he's even in the territory. The town sheriff is a good man, but he's got 2 deputies and a jail that won't hold determined outlaws for more than a night." The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. This wasn't Boston, where problems could be solved with lawyers and police and proper procedures. This was the frontier, where survival often depended on personal strength and the help of allies who might prove as dangerous as enemies. "Then what do you suggest?" she asked. Silas was quiet for a long moment, gazing out over the vast wilderness that stretched to the horizon. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of careful consideration. "Your father was a smart man. He chose his land well, not just for its resources, but for its defensibility. The mining claims are in valleys that can be watched from high ground. The grazing land has water sources that would be difficult for raiders to control. But he made one mistake, which was he tried to hold it alone. A single man, even a determined one, can't defend thousands of acres against organized opposition." Beatrice felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Are you saying the land is indefensible?" "No, I'm saying it requires the right kind of defense. Knowledge of the terrain, understanding of how outlaws think and operate, and the skills to turn wilderness into an advantage rather than a liability." She began to understand what he was suggesting, but the implications frightened her almost, as much as Blackjack Morrison's threats had. "You're proposing an alliance." "I'm proposing survival," Silas corrected. "Morrison's gang has been terrorizing this territory for 2 years. They've driven out a dozen families, stolen cattle and horses, burned buildings, and worse. Your father was one of the few who refused to pay tribute, and they killed him for it." The blunt statement hit her like a physical blow. "Killed him? But Harrison said he died of pneumonia." "He did. But pneumonia doesn't usually strike healthy men in their prime. Word is that Morrison's men contaminated his water supply with something that weakened his constitution. They're smart enough to make their murders look like natural causes when it serves their purposes. Rage blazed through Beatrice, hot and pure. Her father, for all his flaws, had been a strong man who believed in building something worthwhile in the wilderness. The thought of him dying slowly, poisoned by cowards who struck from shadows, ignited something fierce in her spirit. What would this alliance involve? She asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. You have legal claim to the land and the resources to develop it properly. I have knowledge of the territory and the skills to protect it. Together, we might be able to build something that can stand against Morrison's gang and anyone else who thinks the frontier is there for the taking. It was a reasonable proposition. But Beatrice found herself studying Silas's face, trying to read the motivations behind his offer. He was a man who had chosen isolation, who lived alone in the mountains by choice. Why would he willingly entangle himself in her problems? What do you gain from this arrangement? She asked directly. Silas was quiet for a moment, his grey-green eyes distant. I've spent 8 years watching good people driven from their homes by men like Morrison. I've told myself it wasn't my fight, that I chose solitude for good reasons. But when I saw your father's determination to build something lasting here, and now seeing the same spirit in you, I realized that some fights can't be avoided forever. There was something in his tone that suggested deeper currents, old wounds, and regrets that he wasn't ready to share. But Beatrice sensed the sincerity in his words, and more importantly, she recognized that her alternatives were limited. I don't know anything about frontier life, she admitted. I can ride, but I've never lived outdoors. I can shoot, but only at targets on a gentleman's estate. I know nothing about mining or ranching or any of the practical matters my father dealt with. You can learn, Silas said simply. The question is whether you want to badly enough. As if to emphasize the urgency of their situation, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed up from the valley below. Silas immediately moved to the edge of the plateau, peering down through the trees with the alertness of a man accustomed to danger. Morrison's men, he said after a moment. 4 riders, moving fast toward town. They'll be spreading word about what happened today, recruiting more guns. The sight of Silas's silver spurs caught the afternoon sunlight as one of the outlaws rode past far below, and Beatrice realized she was looking at evidence of their leader's ruthless organization. Blackjack Morrison wasn't just a common bandit. He was building an empire of intimidation and control across the territory. How long do we have? She asked. Not long. Morrison won't let today's defeat stand without response. He'll come back with 20 men instead of 7, and he'll come prepared for a war. Beatrice touched the cameo brooch at her throat, thinking of her mother's quiet strength and her father's stubborn determination to build something lasting in the wilderness. Then she looked at Silas McGraw, this unlikely ally who offered protection and partnership in equal measure. If we do this, she said slowly, if we make this alliance, I want to understand the terms clearly. I won't be treated as a helpless woman who needs constant protection. I want to learn what I need to know to hold my own. Something that might have been approval flickered in Silas's eyes. Fair enough, but you'll need to trust my judgment about what you're ready for, and when. The frontier has its own lessons, and some of them can kill you if you learn them too quickly. Agreed, and in return, you'll have a partner who knows this territory better than Morrison ever will, and who has reasons of his own to see that his gang doesn't succeed. They shook hands then, her small fingers disappearing entirely within his massive palm. But his grip was gentle, careful of his strength, and she sensed that this simple gesture was sealing more than just a business arrangement. Where do we start? She asked. Silas shouldered his walking stick and gestured toward the higher peaks. With shelter, Morrison will be watching the town and the main trails now. We need a base of operations that he can't find, where you can learn what you need to know without constant fear of attack. As they prepared to leave the plateau, Beatrice took one last look at the valley below, where her father's dreams and her own uncertain future lay waiting. Tomorrow, she would begin. learning to become someone she had never imagined being. Tonight, she would place her trust in a mountain man whose reputation was built on legends and whose true nature remained largely mysterious. But as thunder carried her higher into the peaks, following Silas's sure-footed guidance toward whatever sanctuary he had in mind, Beatrice felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's letter arrived, a sense of purpose and possibility that made the dangers ahead seem like challenges to be met rather than obstacles to be feared. The frontier was about to test them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The hidden valley revealed itself only when they were nearly upon it, a secret pocket of meadowland nestled between towering granite walls that rose like cathedral spires toward the evening sky. Silas had led them through what seemed like an impassable maze of boulders and dense pine forest, following paths that Beatrice would never have noticed on her own. "How did you find this place?" she asked as they descended into the valley. "Thunder's silver bridle, catching the last rays of sunlight that slanted between the peaks. Your father showed it to me," Silas replied, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been fondness. 3 years ago, when he first began exploring the territory seriously, he called it his ace in the hole, a place where a person could disappear completely if circumstances required it. The valley was perhaps 2 acres in size, with a clear stream running through its center and grass that looked rich enough to support thunder comfortably. At the far end, barely visible until they were close to it, stood a small but solid log cabin that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape around it. "Your father built this?" Beatrice asked, dismounting to examine the structure more closely. "We built it together," Silas corrected. "He provided the vision and the materials I couldn't fashion myself. I provided the knowledge of how to build something that would last in this climate and remain hidden from casual observation." The cabin was a marvel of practical construction. Its walls were made of carefully fitted logs, chinked with mud and moss to keep out the mountain cold. The roof was covered with sod, making it nearly invisible from above, and the single window faced the valley entrance, providing a clear view of anyone approaching. Inside, the cabin was larger than it appeared. From outside, with a stone fireplace, built-in shelves and sleeping alcoves that could accommodate several people comfortably, everything was clean and well-maintained, suggesting that Silas had been caring for the place even after her father's death. "There are supplies cached here," Silas explained, opening a cleverly concealed storage area beneath the floorboards. "Enough food, ammunition and medical supplies to last 2 people several months if necessary. Your father was a man who believed in being prepared for any eventuality. As darkness fell over the valley, they worked together to settle thunder, in a natural corral formed by fallen logs and strategic placement of boulders. The stallion seemed content with the rich grass and clear water, though Beatrice noticed he remained alert to the strange sounds of the mountain wilderness around them. By firelight, Silas began her education in frontier survival. He showed her how to read weather signs in the behavior of wildlife, how to identify edible plants, and how to move through forest without leaving obvious trails for pursuers to follow. "Your father was right about one thing," he said, as they sat by the fire after a simple meal of beans and venison. "You do have spirit and intelligence, but the frontier will test both in ways that Boston society never could." Beatrice found herself studying his face in the flickering light, noting the intelligence in his eyes and the careful way he chose his words. "What brought you to this life, Mr. McGraw? You speak like an educated man, yet you've chosen to live in isolation like a hermit." For a long moment, Silas was quiet, staring into the fire with an expression that suggested old pain carefully controlled. When he spoke, his voice was measured and thoughtful. "I wasn't always alone," he said finally. 8 years ago, I lived in Denver, working as a territorial surveyor and deputy marshal. I had a wife, Sarah, and plans to build a proper life in a growing town." He paused, and Beatrice sensed she was hearing something he rarely shared with anyone. Sarah was killed by outlaws. Not Morrison's gang, but men much like them. I was away, on a surveying expedition when they came through town, demanding tribute from the merchants. Sarah was helping at the general store that day, and when the owner refused to pay, they decided to make an example. The stark words hit Beatrice like physical blows. She could see the grief in his posture, the way his massive hands clenched, and relaxed as he fought to control emotions that even 8 years hadn't fully healed. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. Silas nodded acknowledgement but continued his story. "I tracked those men for 6 months. Found them, brought them to justice, some to trial, others to graves. But when it was over, I realized that Denver held nothing but memories I couldn't bear to face every day. So I came here, to the mountains, where the only law is what a man makes for himself. But now you're willing to fight again. Now I'm realizing that running from the problem doesn't make it go away. It just allows it to spread to other places, to threaten other innocent people." He looked at her directly, his grey-green eyes reflecting the firelight. "Your father reminded me that some things are worth fighting for, even if the cost is high." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the mountain valley, the distant call of owls, the rustle of small creatures. Moving through the grass, the whisper of wind through the pines. Beatrice found herself thinking about the dramatic change in her circumstances over the past few days, from Boston drawing rooms to a hidden cabin in the Colorado wilderness. "Tell me about Thunder," Silas said eventually, apparently sensing her need for lighter conversation. "He's clearly more than just a horse to you." Beatrice smiled, grateful for the change of subject. "My father gave him to me for my 18th birthday, one of the few times I remember him showing genuine affection. Thunder was just a yearling then, all legs and attitude. I trained him myself, spent hours every day working with him until we understood each other perfectly. He trusts you completely. That's rare between horse and rider, especially with an animal that's spirited. We've been through a great deal together. When my mother was dying, I would spend entire days riding the countryside around Boston, trying to outrun my grief. Thunder seemed to understand what I needed, sometimes speed and reckless freedom, sometimes just the comfort of having another living creature who cared about me." Silas nodded, understanding. "Animals often make better companions than people. They don't judge, don't have hidden agendas, don't betray trust for their own advantage." As the fire burned lower, practical considerations reasserted themselves. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and they both needed rest. Silas had rigged a simple but effective early warning system around the valley entrance, thin wires strung between trees that would create noise if disturbed by intruders. But the knowledge that Morrison's men were likely planning their next move made sleep elusive. "Mr. McGraw," Beatrice said as she settled into one of the sleeping alcoves, "when we begin this partnership in earnest, I want you to know that I understand the risks involved. I'm not approaching this as some kind of romantic adventure. People are going to die before this is over, aren't they?" "Very likely," he replied honestly. "Morrison's gang has killed at least a dozen people that I know of, probably more. They won't give up their control of this territory without a fight, and they won't show mercy to anyone who opposes them. Then we'd better make sure we're better at this business than they are." Something that might have been approval flickered in his expression. "Your father would be proud of you, Miss Langford. You have his determination and your own kind of courage." As Beatrice drifted toward sleep, she found herself thinking about the strange turns that had brought her to this moment. Less than a week ago, she had been planning a quiet life in Boston, perhaps eventually marrying some suitable gentleman and settling into the comfortable predictability of established society. Now she was lying in a hidden cabin in the Colorado mountains, planning to fight a gang of murderous outlaws alongside a man whose reputation was built on legends and whose past was marked by tragedy. The transformation should have terrified her, but instead she felt a growing sense of excitement and purpose. Thunder's soft nickering from the makeshift corral reminded her that she wasn't entirely alone in this strange new world. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it with allies, both human and animal, who had already proven their loyalty and courage. Outside the cabin, the mountain night settled around their hidden valley like a protective blanket, shielding them from the dangers that prowled the lower country while they planned their next moves in the deadly game that Blackjack Morrison had forced them to play. The frontier was vast and unforgiving, but it was also full of possibilities for those brave enough to seize them. As sleep finally claimed her, Beatrice dreamed of riding Thunder across endless meadows toward a future she was only beginning to imagine. The brass compass gleamed in the morning sunlight as Beatrice turned it over in her hands, studying its intricate engravings and precise calibration. She had discovered it among her father's personal effects that Silas had retrieved from the cabin, a surveyor's instrument of obvious quality and evident use. Your father relied on that compass more than most men rely on their prayers, Silas observed, watching her examine the device. He used it to map every inch of his holdings, including some areas that aren't marked on any territorial survey. They were standing at the edge of the hidden valley, looking down toward the lower country where morning mist still clung to the valleys and creek beds. 3 days of intensive training had begun to transform Beatrice's understanding of frontier life, though she was acutely aware of how much she still needed to learn. "The markings here," she said, pointing to small scratches on the compasses. "Her face, they correspond to the notations on his maps." "Secret markings," Silas confirmed. "Your father discovered something about his land that he didn't want recorded in any official documents. Something valuable enough to kill for if the wrong people found out about it." The implications were sobering. Beatrice had assumed that Blackjack Morrison's interest in her property stemmed from simple greed, valuable grazing land, and potential mineral rights that could be stolen through intimidation. But if her father had discovered something specific, something significant enough to require coded notations and secret surveys, then the stakes were higher than she had realized. "What do you think he found?" she asked. Silas was quiet for a moment, his grey-green eyes scanning the landscape below them with the practiced alertness she was learning to associate with his constant awareness of potential danger. "Silver, most likely. Maybe gold. The geological formations in this area suggest both possibilities, but there's something else, something your father hinted at but never explained fully." "What kind of something else?" "Water rights. In country this dry, water is more valuable than precious metals. A man who controls the major water sources controls everything else. Grazing, mining, settlement, transportation. Your father's land includes the headwaters of 3 major creeks that feed the entire valley system." The strategic importance of this information struck Beatrice immediately. No wonder Morrison was so determined to control her father's holdings. With water rights came the power to make or break every other operation in the territory. "Show me," she said, spreading her father's detailed maps on a flat boulder. For the next hour, Silas traced the water systems that flowed through and around her inherited land, explaining how control of the headwaters would allow someone to divert or limit water access for dozens of downstream users. Ranchers, miners, and farmers all depended on reliable water sources. A person who could deny or guarantee such access would wield enormous power. "Morrison understands this," Silas said. "That's why he's been so aggressive about acquiring land rights in this area. He's not just running a protection racket, he's building a monopoly on the resources that determine who can survive and prosper here." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their discussion. Silas immediately moved to a concealed observation post he had prepared, while Beatrice gathered the maps and compass, tucking them safely inside her jacket. "2 riders," Silas whispered after a moment of careful observation. "Moving slowly. Tracking something. They're good, better than the men Morrison usually employs." Through his improvised telescope, a clever arrangement of mirrors and lenses he had constructed from materials in the cabin, Beatrice could see the riders clearly. They were indeed different from the rough outlaws she had encountered before. These men moved with professional competence, their eyes constantly scanning the terrain for signs that most people would miss entirely. "Bounty hunters," Silas said grimly. "Morrison's hired specialists. They'll be tracking us from yesterday's encounter, looking for our trail. Can they find this valley? Eventually. Good trackers can follow sign that's days old, and we left. More traces than I would have preferred when we brought Thunder up here." The reality of their situation was becoming clearer by the hour. They weren't just hiding from a gang of common outlaws. They were being hunted by professionals who wouldn't give up easily or make the kinds of mistakes that might allow for escape. "What are our options?" Beatrice asked, surprised by how calm she sounded, despite the fear gnawing at her stomach. "We can run deeper into the mountains, try to lose them in terrain so rough that even experienced trackers would have difficulty following, but that means abandoning everything your father built, letting Morrison claim the land by default. Or we make our stand here, use the advantages this valley provides, and hope we're better at this business than they are." Beatrice thought of her father's compass, still warm in her jacket pocket, and the careful notations he had made about water rights and mineral deposits. All of that knowledge and planning would be worthless if she ran now, leaving Morrison free to exploit the resources her father had died to protect. "I won't run," she said quietly. "This land belongs to me, and I intend to keep it." Silas studied her face for a long moment, perhaps looking for signs of false bravado or unrealistic confidence. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. "Then we need to even the odds," he said. "Two against however many Morrison sends won't be sustainable for long. We need allies, people with reasons of their own to see Morrison's operation shut down." "Who did you have in mind?" "There's a Ute band that camps in the high country during summer months. Their leader, Standing Bear, has been fighting Morrison's encroachment on traditional hunting grounds for 2 years. He's a man of honor and considerable tactical skill. The idea of forming an alliance with Native Americans would have scandalized Boston society, but Beatrice was beginning to understand that frontier survival required a different kind of thinking. Traditional prejudices and social conventions became luxuries that could prove fatal when practical cooperation meant the difference. Between life and death, would he be willing to help us? Possibly. Standing Bear respected your father, and he understands that Morrison represents a threat to everyone who values freedom over fear. But approaching him will require leaving our defensive position here, and that's risky with professional trackers in the area." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of horses moving through the forest below grew closer. The bounty hunters were working their way methodically up the mountainside, following whatever trail they had found. "How much time do we have?" Beatrice asked. "Hard to say. Could be hours, could be days. Depends on how good they are and how much sign we left behind." Beatrice felt the weight of decision pressing down on her like a physical force. Every choice carried potentially fatal consequences, and she was still learning to navigate a world where mistakes weren't just embarrassing, they were deadly. "If we're going to seek allies," she said finally, "we should do it while we still have the freedom to move. Once we're trapped in this valley, our options become much more limited." Silas nodded approvingly. "Sound reasoning. But it means traveling through country where Morrison's men are actively hunting us, and it means leaving Thunder behind. He's too distinctive. A horse like that draws attention from miles away." The thought of leaving Thunder behind was painful, but Beatrice was learning to think strategically rather than emotionally. The stallion's magnificent appearance, which had been a source of pride in Boston, had become a liability in a land where survival often depended on remaining invisible. "How long would it take to reach Standing Bear's camp?" 2 days on foot, moving carefully and avoiding the main trails. 3 days if we have to detour around search parties. 2 days without shelter, traveling through hostile territory with professional manhunters tracking them. The risks were enormous, but the alternative, remaining trapped in the hidden valley until Morrison's forces found them, seemed equally dangerous. "When do we leave?" she asked. tonight, travel at night, rest during the day in whatever cover we can find. It's harder on us, but it makes tracking much more difficult for our pursuers. As they prepared for the dangerous journey ahead, Beatrice found herself thinking about the remarkable changes in her life over the past week. She had gone from planning garden parties in Boston drawing rooms to preparing for a nighttime trek through Indian territory, from worrying about social conventions to learning the deadly serious business of frontier survival. The transformation should have overwhelmed her, but instead she felt a growing sense of competence and purpose. Each challenge met and overcome built confidence for the next one. Each skill learned made the wilderness seem slightly less threatening and more like a domain she might eventually master. "Miss Langford," Silas said, as they cached supplies and prepared their packs for travel, "I want you to understand that what we're attempting is dangerous beyond anything you've faced so far. Standing Bear's people are allies, but approaching any armed camp in hostile territory carries risks, and Morrison's hunters will be looking for exactly the kind of movement we'll be making. Are you trying to give me a chance to change my mind? I'm making sure you understand what you're choosing. Once we leave this valley, there's no turning back. We'll be committed to a course of action that ends either in victory or death." Beatrice touched the compass in her pocket again, thinking of her father's determination to build something lasting in the wilderness. Then she looked at Silas, this unlikely ally whose own tragic past had brought him to this moment of decision. "Mr. McGraw," she said quietly, "a week ago I was a sheltered woman whose greatest concern was choosing the proper dress for afternoon tea. Today I'm planning military alliances with Indian chiefs to fight a war against organized criminals. If I can adapt to that much change, I think I can handle whatever comes next." As evening approached and they made final preparations for their dangerous journey, Beatrice felt the weight of her father's legacy and her own evolving identity settling around her like a mantle of responsibility. The frightened heiress who had stepped off the stagecoach in Rocky Creek was gone forever, replaced by someone harder, more capable, and infinitely more determined. Tonight, they would venture into the darkness of the Colorado wilderness, seeking allies in their fight against the forces that threatened to destroy everything her father had worked to build. Whether they would return victorious or not, return at all, remained to be seen. But as she watched Silas check his weapons and study the maps one final time, Beatrice knew that whatever happened, she would face it with the kind of courage her father would have recognized and respected. The frontier had tested them both and found them worthy of the challenges ahead. The wedding ring caught starlight as Beatrice turned it absently around her finger, a nervous habit she had developed during their 2 days of careful travel through the high country. The delicate gold band had belonged to her grandmother, then her mother, and now served as her only remaining connection to the genteel world she had left behind. "Thinking of home?" Silas asked quietly from where he sat, keeping watch at the edge of their small camp. They were sheltered in a grove of aspen trees, high enough in the mountains that the air carried the sharp clarity of snow-fed streams and pine forests. "Thinking of what home means," Beatrice replied. "A week ago, home was a specific house on a specific street in Boston. Now I'm not sure where home is supposed to be." They had been traveling for 2 nights, moving through country so wild and beautiful that it sometimes took her breath away. During the day, they rested in hidden valleys or dense forest, always alert for signs of pursuit. At night, they followed game trails and creek beds, moving steadily toward the high meadows where Standing Bear's band made their summer camp. The journey had deepened her understanding of both the wilderness and her unusual companion. Silas moved through the mountains with an almost supernatural awareness of his surroundings, reading signs in bent grass and disturbed stones that were completely invisible to her untrained eyes. He seemed to know instinctively when weather was changing, when wildlife was nervous about human presence nearby, when a particular trail was safe to follow, and when it should be avoided. But it was during their conversations in the quiet hours, before dawn, that Beatrice began to understand the man behind the legendary reputation. Silas McGraw was indeed the educated gentleman his speech suggested, the son of a college professor who had come west to survey territorial boundaries for the federal government. His transformation into a mountain hermit had been driven by grief and disillusionment, but underneath the wilderness pragmatism lay a thoughtful man who missed the intellectual stimulation of civilized conversation. "Tell me about your marriage," Beatrice said, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I'm sorry, that was inappropriate." "No," Silas said gently. "It's a fair question from someone who's trusting me with her life. You have a right to understand who I am and what drives me." He was quiet for a moment, gazing up at the brilliant display of stars that city dwellers like Beatrice rarely had the opportunity to see in their full glory. "Sarah was a teacher," he said finally. "Came to Denver to help establish the first real school in the territory. She was small and determined and absolutely fearless about taking on challenges that would have intimidated men twice her size." "How did you meet her?" "I was surveying a town site, and she was arguing with the territorial commissioner about where the schoolhouse should be built. She had very specific ideas about educational requirements, proper lighting, adequate ventilation, space for a library. The commissioner wanted to put it in the cheapest possible location. Sarah was having none of it, despite the sadness in his voice. Beatrice could hear affection and pride as well. Did she win the argument? Eventually. Sarah had a way of wearing down opposition through sheer persistence and logical reasoning. By the time she was finished with him, the commissioner was convinced that her educational requirements were actually his own brilliant ideas. "She sounds formidable." She was. And she was also kind, funny, and completely devoted to the idea that the frontier needed to be more than just a place where people came to get rich and leave. She wanted to build communities, establish institutions, create something that would last and matter. Beatrice found herself thinking of her own evolving relationship with the wilderness and its possibilities. "Is that why you're helping me now? Because my father had similar goals." Silas turned to look at her directly, his grey-green eyes serious in the starlight. "Partly, but also because I see some of Sarah's qualities in you, that same determination to build something worthwhile instead of just taking what you can get." The comparison was both flattering and intimidating. Beatrice had never thought of herself as particularly courageous or determined, but the past week had revealed capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. "Mr. McGraw," she said hesitantly, "there's something I need to tell you about my reasons for staying and fighting instead of returning to Boston." "I'm listening." "It's not just about honoring my father's memory or claiming my inheritance. The truth is, I have nothing to return to in Boston. No family, no close friends, no particular purpose or meaning to my life there. When I received word of my father's death, I realized that I had been existing rather than living, going through the motions of social conventions without any real engagement or joy." She paused, surprised by her own honesty, but somehow compelled to continue. "This wilderness, dangerous as it is, makes me feel more alive than I've ever felt before, learning to survive, facing real challenges with meaningful consequences, working toward goals that matter. It's as if I've discovered who I was meant to be all along." Silas nodded slowly. "The frontier has that effect on some people. It strips away all the artificial layers and forces you to discover what's really essential about yourself. Is that what happened to you? In a way. Though in my case, it took tragedy to force that discovery. You seem to be making the choice more deliberately." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the high country. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called to its mate, and small creatures rustled through the undergrowth on their eternal quests for food and shelter. "Tomorrow night we should reach Standing Bear's camp," Silas said eventually. "I should prepare you for what to expect." Hoot culture is different from anything you've encountered, and first impressions will be crucial to our success. What should I know? Honesty is valued above all else. Don't try to be something you're not, but don't apologize for who you are. Either, Standing Bear respects courage and straightforwardness. If he asks you direct questions, answer them directly. Will he speak English? Fluently. He was educated at a mission school when he was young, though he chose to return to his people's traditional ways. He understands both worlds and moves between them as circumstances require. As dawn approached, they made their usual preparations for a day of rest and concealment. But as Beatrice settled into her blankets, she found sleep elusive. The wedding ring on her finger seemed to symbolize all the expectations and conventions she was leaving behind, while the unknown challenges ahead required a different kind of courage than her grandmother and mother had ever needed to display. When she finally slept, she dreamed of riding thunder across endless meadows toward mountains that seemed to recede with every step, always just beyond reach, but somehow calling her forward toward a destiny she couldn't yet imagine. The sound of distant gunshots woke her near midday. Silas was already alert, his rifle in his hands and his body tense with readiness for action. "How far away?" she whispered. "Maybe 2 miles. Could be hunters, could be Morrison's men. We need to move." They broke camp quickly and efficiently, covering all traces of their presence with the thoroughness that had become second nature over the past few days. But as they prepared to continue their journey towards Standing Bear's camp, both of them knew that their pursuers were getting closer. The race was on, and the stakes couldn't be higher. If they could reach their potential allies in time, they might have a chance of evening the odds in their fight against Morrison's gang. If they were caught in the open by professional manhunters, their brief partnership would end in violence and failure. As they moved deeper into the high country, following trails that seemed to lead toward the very roof of the world, Beatrice touched her grandmother's wedding ring one final time, then slipped it from her finger and tucked it safely into her pocket. The woman who had worn that ring as a symbol of traditional feminine domesticity was gone forever. In her place walked someone harder, more capable, and infinitely more determined to forge her own destiny in the untamed wilderness of the Colorado Territory. Whatever lay ahead, she would meet it on her own terms. The wanted poster was yellowed with age and weather, but the face staring back at Beatrice from the cracked paper was unmistakably younger version of Black Jack Morrison. The reward offered was substantial. $5,000 for the capture of Jack Morrison, also known as Black Jack, wanted for robbery, murder, and the killing of Deputy U.S. Marshal Samuel McGraw. The poster had been tacked to a tree at the edge of Standing Bear's camp, and Beatrice stared at it with growing comprehension and horror. The pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed were suddenly falling into place with sickening clarity. "Samuel McGraw," she whispered, reading the name again. "Your brother?" Silas stood beside her, his massive frame rigid with tension, his grey-green eyes fixed on the poster with an expression of pain that seemed to encompass years of grief and guilt. "My younger brother," he said quietly. 2 years younger, but always the braver one. Always the one who wanted to make things right, to see justice done properly. Standing Bear emerged from his lodge, a man of perhaps 50 with silver-streaked hair and eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of someone who had seen both the best and worst of human nature. He moved with the quiet dignity that Beatrice was learning to associate with true strength. "I wondered when you would see that," Standing Bear said, his English precise and unaccented. "I have kept it these 4 years, waiting for the right moment to show it to the man who once called himself Deputy Marshal Silas McGraw." The revelation hit Beatrice like a physical blow. Silas hadn't just been a territorial surveyor. He had been a federal law enforcement officer, and Black Jack Morrison had killed his brother. Everything about their current situation suddenly took on new dimensions of personal vendetta and tragic history. 4 years ago," Silas said, his voice carrying the weight of long-suppressed emotion. Sam was tracking Morrison's gang through the territory south of here. They were hitting trading posts and isolated ranches, killing anyone who could identify them. Sam was always meticulous about building his cases. He wanted to capture them alive, bring them to trial, make sure justice was done according to law. "What happened?" Beatrice asked, though she dreaded the answer. Standing Bear gestured for them to sit by his fire, then settled himself across from them with the grave formality of a man about to relate important history. "Your brother was betrayed," Standing Bear said to Silas. "Someone in Denver told Morrison where the marshal would be, when he would be there, how many men he had with him. It was an ambush designed to look like a fair fight, but Morrison's gang had every advantage. Sam was alone when they found him," Silas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Shot 3 times in the back, left to die slowly. By the time I found his body, he'd been dead for 2 days. The campfire crackled in the silence that followed, and Beatrice found herself struggling to process the implications of what she was learning. The man she had come to trust, the ally she had depended upon for survival, had been concealing a personal war that made their current conflict infinitely more dangerous. "That's why you left Denver," she said. "Why you became a hermit." "In the mountains. I spent 6 months tracking the men who killed Sam," Silas replied. "Found most of them, brought some to trial, buried the others where they fell, but Morrison escaped, disappeared completely. I assumed he had left the territory, maybe gone to California or Mexico. Instead, he came here," Standing Bear said, "built a new gang, started the same business of intimidation and murder that got your brother killed. For 2 years now, my people have watched him grow stronger, more bold. We have lost 3 young warriors to his guns." The personal dimension of their conflict was staggering. This wasn't just about Beatrice's inheritance or even about frontier justice. It was about a blood debt that had been unpaid for 4 years, and about Silas's failure to complete the mission that had cost his brother his life. "You should have told me," Beatrice said, anger and hurt warring in her voice. "I had a right to know that I wasn't just fighting for my land. I was walking into the middle of your private war." Silas met her gaze directly, and she could see the pain and regret in his expression. "You're right. I should have told you. But I was afraid that if you knew the full truth, you'd realize how personal this is for me, how my judgment might be compromised by the need for revenge." "Is it compromised?" "I don't know," he admitted with brutal honesty. "I've spent 4 years trying to convince myself that Sam's death was just another casualty of frontier violence, that the best thing I could do was withdraw from the world and let others fight the battles that needed fighting. But when I saw Morrison threatening you, saw him using the same tactics that got good people killed before, you saw a chance to finish what you started 4 years ago," Standing Bear concluded. "Maybe. Or maybe I saw a chance to finally do something right, to protect someone, instead of failing them the way I failed Sam." Beatrice felt her anger beginning to transform into something more complex. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding of the terrible burden Silas had been carrying. The isolation, the withdrawal from civilization, the hermit's existence, all of it made sense now as the response of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him and blamed himself for the loss. "What do you know about Morrison's current operation?" she asked Standing Bear, forcing herself to focus on practical considerations rather than the emotional turmoil of recent revelations. "He has perhaps 30 men now, divided into 3 groups that work different parts of the territory. His main camp is in the old mining settlement at Devil's Canyon, about 2 days' ride from your father's land. He calls himself a businessman, now claims to be providing security services to legitimate enterprises. But he's still the same killer he always was," Silas said grimly. "Yes. But now he has political protection, connections to territorial officials who profit from his operations. Arresting him, even killing him, would not end the threat he represents. His organization would continue under new leadership." The scope of the problem was becoming clear. Morrison wasn't just a gang leader anymore. He was the head of a criminal enterprise that had infected the legitimate power structure of the territory. Fighting him would require more than superior firepower or tactical skill. There's something else, Standing Bear continued. Morrison knows you are here, Silas McGraw, knows you survived your brother's death and have been living in these mountains. He has been waiting for you to reveal yourself, planning for the day when he could finish what he started 4 years ago. He's using me as bait, Beatrice realized with growing horror. My father's land, the threats against me, it was all designed to draw Silas into the open, where Morrison could finally complete his revenge. Partly yes, but your land is also valuable for its own sake. Morrison needs water rights and mineral claims to legitimize his operations, to transform his gang into a business empire that territorial authorities will protect instead of prosecute. As the full dimensions of their situation became clear, Beatrice felt a crushing sense of responsibility and fear. She had thought she was fighting for her inheritance and her father's legacy. Instead, she had become a pawn in a deadly game of personal vendetta and political corruption that stretched far beyond her individual concerns. So what do we do now? She asked. Run? Fight? Try to find some way to expose the corruption? We do what we came here to do, Silas said, his voice carrying new determination. We ask Standing Bear for help, we make our plans, and we see this through to whatever end awaits us, even knowing that Morrison has been planning for exactly this confrontation, especially knowing that my brother died because I wasn't there. To protect him, I won't let that happen to you. Standing Bear nodded slowly, his wise eyes moving between them as he evaluated their resolve and their chances of success. My warriors and I will help you, he said finally, not just because Morrison threatens our traditional lands, but because some debts can only be paid in blood, and some battles must be fought regardless of the odds. As darkness settled over the high mountain camp, Beatrice stared into the fire and tried to process the dramatic shift in her understanding of everything that had brought her to this moment. The naive heiress who had stepped off the stagecoach in Rocky Creek was truly gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that survival sometimes required accepting terrible truths and making choices that civilized society would never comprehend. Tomorrow, they would begin planning for a confrontation that had been 4 years in the making, a battle that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone who believed that justice was worth fighting for, no matter the personal cost. The Colt revolver lay heavy in Silas's hands as he cleaned and inspected every component with the meticulous care of a man preparing for his final battle. The weapon had belonged to his father, a Presbyterian minister who had carried it through the Mexican War before trading military service for a life devoted to education and faith. Now it would serve a different kind of righteousness, the harsh justice of the frontier, where law was often enforced at gunpoint by those brave enough to stand against chaos. Tell me about the gun, Beatrice said, settling beside him at their campfire. They had returned to the hidden valley to make final preparations, and the weight of approaching confrontation hung over them like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. My father carried it at Buena Vista, Silas replied, his voice reflective as he examined the cylinder's alignment. He was a chaplain, but chaplains had to fight alongside everyone else when the shooting started. After the war, he never spoke of what he'd done with it, but he cleaned it every Sunday after church services. Did he know you became a lawman? He died before I took the badge. Sometimes I wonder what he would have thought about his sons choosing lives of violence in service of peace. Standing Bear's warriors had departed at dawn, moving through the mountains with the silent efficiency that made them legendary among both allies and enemies. Their plan was ambitious and dangerous, a coordinated attack on Morrison's main camp that would draw his forces away from the hidden valleys where Beatrice's inheritance lay waiting. But the tactical considerations were secondary to the personal reckonings that awaited all of them. 4 years of grief and guilt had led to this moment when old debts would finally be settled and the dead would either be avenged or joined by the living. I've been thinking about what Standing Bear said. Beatrice continued, watching Silas work with practiced hands that betrayed no nervousness despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. About Morrison using me as bait to draw you into the open. Regrets? No, but I want to understand something. She paused, choosing her words carefully. When you agreed to help me, was it because you cared about my father's legacy and my inheritance, or because you saw an opportunity for revenge? Silas was quiet for a long moment, his attention apparently focused on loading cartridges into the cylinder. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute honesty. Both, he said simply. I won't lie to you about that. Not now, when we might both die tomorrow. I saw Morrison threatening you, and part of me thought, finally, a chance to finish what I started. But that wasn't the only reason, Beatrice. The use of her first name, spoken with gentle intimacy, sent warmth through her chest, despite the cold mountain air. What were the other reasons? You reminded me of Sarah, not in appearance, but in spirit, that same determination to build something worthwhile instead of just surviving from day to day. And you reminded me of Sam, too, that absolute refusal to be intimidated by people who mistake cruelty for strength. He looked at her directly then, his grey-green eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. But mostly, I helped you because watching you discover your own courage and strength made me remember why life is worth fighting for. You brought light back into a world that had been dark for too long. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Beatrice felt her heart racing as she recognized the depth of feeling in his words, the vulnerability that such honesty required from a man who had spent years hiding from both the world and his own emotions. Silas, she said softly, testing the sound of his name on her lips. I need you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, these past weeks have been the most alive I've ever felt. You've shown me capabilities I never knew I possessed, helped me become someone I actually respect and admire. You were always that person. The frontier just gave you permission to let her out. They moved closer together, drawn by forces neither fully understood, but both recognized as profound and irreversible. When Silas reached out to touch her face, his massive hand was gentle as a whisper against her skin. I should tell you something. Elsa, he said, his voice barely audible above the crackling of their fire. Win or lose tomorrow, I'm glad I lived long enough to know you, Beatrice Langford. You've given me something I thought died with Sam and Sarah. Hope that the world can still produce people worth dying to protect. The kiss that followed was inevitable, tender, and charged with the desperate intensity of two people who had found love at the edge of disaster. Beatrice had been kissed before, by proper Boston gentlemen in proper Boston parlors, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for the overwhelming combination of strength and gentleness that Silas offered. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, the mountain night seemed charged with possibility, despite the dangers that tomorrow would bring. We should rest, Silas said reluctantly. Tomorrow will demand everything we have to give. But neither moved away from the other. Instead, they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead while their minds processed the dramatic changes that had transformed both their lives over the past few weeks. Do you think we can actually succeed? Beatrice asked eventually. Morrison has 30 men, political connections, 4 years to plan for exactly this confrontation. We have 6 Ute warriors, 2 people with minimal combat experience, and the element of surprise. In terms of raw numbers, we're probably doomed, Silas admitted with surprising calm. But Morrison has one crucial weakness. He thinks this is still about money and territory. He doesn't understand that it's really about justice and love, and people will take much greater risks for those than they will for profit. And you? What will you risk? Everything, he he said simply. "My life, my freedom, my chance at future happiness, everything I have or ever hope to have, because some things are worth more than personal survival." As they settled into their blankets, for what might be their last night together, Beatrice found herself thinking about the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a bored socialite in a comfortable Boston drawing room. Tonight, she was a woman in love with a mountain man, preparing to fight a war against organized crime in the Colorado wilderness. The transformation should have terrified her, but instead she felt a deep sense of rightness about the path she had chosen. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it as herself, not as society expected her to be, but as she had chosen to become. "Silas," she whispered, as sleep began to claim them both. "Yes, if we survive this, will you stay? Will you help me build something lasting on my father's land? If we survive this, I'll stay as long as you'll have me. And we'll build something together that neither of us could create alone." The promise hung in the mountain air like a benediction as they drifted towards sleep, holding each other against the cold night and the uncertain future that awaited them. With the dawn, in a few hours, they would ride toward their confrontation with Blackjack Morrison, carrying weapons that had served previous generations in their own battles against injustice. Behind them lay the safe obscurity of withdrawal and isolation. Ahead waited either victory and the chance to build a life together, or death, and the hope that their sacrifice might inspire others to continue the fight. But for now, in the quiet sanctuary of their hidden valley, two people who had found unexpected love in the midst of violence allowed themselves to dream of a future where strength served compassion, where courage was rewarded with peace, and where the wilderness could be home to something more meaningful than mere survival. Tomorrow would test everything they had learned about themselves and each other. Tonight was for holding close the reasons that such tests were worth taking. The Derringer pistol felt impossibly small in Beatrice's palm as she checked its twin barrels one final time. The delicate weapon had been her mother's, a lady's gun, designed more for deterring unwanted advances in civilized society than for the deadly serious business of frontier warfare. But it was perfectly suited to her hand, and she had spent hours over the past weeks learning to use it with deadly accuracy at close range. Dawn was breaking over Devil's Canyon as they took their positions for the assault on Morrison's stronghold. The abandoned mining settlement stretched below them like a scar on the landscape. Ramshackle buildings, tailings piles, and the skeletal remains of machinery left behind when the easy silver played out years earlier. Morrison had chosen his base well. The canyon had only 2 approaches, both easily defended, and the old mine workings provided natural fortifications that would require a frontal assault to breach. Under normal circumstances, attacking such a position would be suicide for a small force, but these weren't normal circumstances, and Standing Bear's plan took advantage of every weakness in Morrison's apparently impregnable position. "Remember," Silas said quietly, his father's Colt revolver steady in his hand, "we're not trying to kill all of them. We're trying to force Morrison into the open where this can be finished properly." The first phase of the attack began with Standing Bear's warriors creating diversions on the canyon's east rim. Gunshots echoed off the rock walls as the Ute fighters engaged Morrison's sentries, making it appear that a larger force was attempting to storm the main entrance to the settlement. From their concealed position on the west side of the canyon, Beatrice watched through field glasses as outlaws poured from the buildings, taking defensive positions and returning fire against the apparent assault. She counted at least 20 men, all armed with rifles and moving with the tactical competence of experienced fighters. "There," Silas whispered, pointing toward a figure emerging from the largest building. Morrison himself, even at distance. Blackjack Morrison was unmistakable. Tall, lean, dressed in his signature black clothing with silver spurs that caught the morning light. He moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to command, shouting orders that sent his men scrambling to reinforce their defensive positions. "He's taking the bait," Beatrice observed, watching as more outlaws rushed toward the eastern rim, where Standing Bear's warriors maintained their diversionary attack. The second phase began when Silas and Beatrice started their descent into the canyon through a narrow ravine that the outlaws had left unguarded. The route was treacherous, requiring them to navigate loose rock and steep slopes while remaining invisible to the defenders above. Halfway down, disaster nearly struck when a section of shale gave way under Beatrice's feet, sending stones clattering into the canyon below. She caught herself against the rock wall, heart pounding, as they both froze and waited to see if the noise had been noticed. From above came shouts of alarm, but they seemed focused on the continuing firefight at the canyon's main entrance. After a tense minute of listening, they continued their careful descent. The old mine workings provided cover as they reached the canyon floor. Rusted equipment and abandoned ore cars created a maze of concealment that allowed them to work their way toward Morrison's headquarters building undetected. "There," Silas whispered, pointing toward a side entrance that appeared to be unguarded. "If we can get inside, we can force him to face us directly instead of hiding behind his men." But as they prepared to make their move, the sound of approaching footsteps sent them scrambling for cover behind an overturned mining cart. 3 of Morrison's men appeared, moving with the alertness of guards checking their perimeter. "Boss wants the western approach checked," one of them said. "Thinks maybe the Indians are trying to flank us." "Indians, my ass," another replied. "This feels like that mountain man everybody talks about, Grizzly McGraw. Morrison's been expecting him to show up eventually. You think he's really here?" "I think Morrison's been planning for this day for 4 years, ever since he killed that deputy marshal. And I think we're about to find out just how good the great Grizzly McGraw really is." The guards moved past their hiding place, but the conversation confirmed Beatrice's worst fears. Morrison wasn't just defending against a random attack. He was prepared for exactly this confrontation, had been anticipating it for years. "He knows you're here," she whispered to Silas. "Then we'd better not disappoint him." They reached the building's side entrance without further incident, but found it barred from the inside. Silas examined the heavy wooden door with professional attention, then produced a set of tools that spoke of capabilities beyond simple mountain survival. "Where did you learn to pick locks?" Beatrice asked as he worked with quiet efficiency. "Federal martial training includes a surprising variety of useful skills," he replied, and moments later the door swung open silently. The interior of Morrison's headquarters was a study in contradictions. Rough frontier construction furnished with expensive items that had obviously been stolen from more civilized locations. A crystal chandelier hung over a poker table made from rough-hewn planks. Oriental rugs covered floors of unfinished wood. They moved through the rooms with careful attention to every sound, every shadow that might conceal an enemy. The building seemed deserted, but Beatrice couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a carefully prepared trap. Her intuition proved correct when they entered what appeared to be Morrison's private office. Blackjack himself sat behind an ornate desk, completely relaxed, his hands folded calmly in front of him. "Silas McGraw," he said conversationally. "Right on time. I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve." "Morrison." Silas's voice was steady, but Beatrice could see the tension in his massive frame as he faced the man who had killed his brother. "And the lovely Miss Langford. My, you've certainly caused me a great deal of trouble, young lady. Though I have to admit, you've provided exactly the motivation I needed to draw your protector out of hiding." "Where are your men?" Beatrice asked, surprised by her own calm. "Occupied with your Indian friends mostly. A few posted where they can ensure we won't be interrupted. This conversation has been 4 years in the making, and I intend to savor every moment of it." Morrison stood slowly, his hand resting casually near the gun at his hip. "Tell me, McGraw, have you spent these 4 years thinking about your brother? About how he died calling your name, wondering why his big brother wasn't there to save him?" Silas's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. I've spent 4 years learning to be patient, learning to plan, learning to make sure that when we finally met again, there would be no possibility of you escaping justice. Justice? Morrison laughed, the sound sharp and cruel in the confined space. This isn't about justice, McGraw. This is about revenge, pure and simple. You want to kill me because I took something precious from you, the same way you took something precious from me when you hunted down my men after your brother's death. Your men were murderers and thieves. My men were family, the only family I ever had, and you systematically destroyed them one by one until I was the only one left. The revelation added another layer of complexity to their confrontation. Morrison's crusade against the territory's legitimate settlers wasn't just about money or power. It was about building a new criminal family to replace the one Silas had destroyed in his quest for justice. So what happens now? Beatrice asked, her derringer steady in her hand despite the trembling she felt throughout her body. Now we settle this properly, Morrison replied. The way these things should be settled between men of honor, a fair fight witnessed by the lady, with the winner taking everything, the territory, the land, the woman. I'm not a prize to be won, Beatrice said sharply. Everything's a prize to be won, sweetheart. That's the fundamental truth of existence. The strong take what they want, the weak lose what they can't defend. Silas stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Morrison and Beatrice. You want to finish this? Let's finish it, but the lady goes free regardless of the outcome. Agreed. Though I suspect she'll be more than happy to console the winner when the dust settles. The formal challenge hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down in medieval combat. But as Beatrice watched both men prepare for what might be their final confrontation, she realized that the true test wasn't just about their individual skills with weapons. It was about whether justice could triumph over vengeance, whether love could prove stronger than hate, and whether two people who had found each other in the wilderness could survive the violent reckoning that had brought them together. The morning sun, streaming through the office windows, illuminated dust motes dancing in the air like spirits of all the men who had died to bring this moment into being. In seconds, that same light would reveal whether their sacrifices had been meaningful or futile. The locket fell from Blackjack Morrison's vest pocket as he staggered backward, his face a mask of shock and pain. Inside the delicate silver case, visible through its broken crystal, was the photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Someone who had once mattered enough to a man now dying that he had carried her image through years of violence and crime. Morrison's hand pressed against the spreading crimson stain on his shirt where Silas's shot had found its mark. But instead of the defiant sneer Beatrice expected, his expression held something approaching regret as he looked down at the fallen locket. Her name was Emma, he said, his voice growing weak but strangely peaceful. My sister died of fever when she was 19, about a year before I met your brother. Silas kept his father's Colt trained on Morrison, but his grey-green eyes showed confusion rather than triumph. What does your sister have to do with Sam's death? Morrison slumped against his ornate desk, the fight leaving him as blood continued to seep between his fingers. Emma always said I had too much anger in me. Said it would destroy everything good I might ever try to build. Turns out she was right. About that, like she was right about most things. The confession hung in the office air like smoke from their gunfight. Beatrice found herself staring at the photograph of the young woman whose death had apparently started Morrison on his path toward becoming a killer and outlaw leader. Sam didn't just find my gang that day, Morrison continued, his voice growing fainter. He found me visiting Emma's grave. First time I'd been there in 3 years. First time I'd allowed myself to remember what I was like before the anger took over. He offered you a chance to surrender, Silas said, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. More than that. He talked about redemption, about second chances, about how people could change if they wanted to badly enough. Reminded me of things Emma used to say. Morrison coughed, specks of blood appearing on his lips. For about 10 minutes I actually considered it. Thought maybe I could find a way back to being the man Emma remembered. What changed your mind? My men showed up. Heard the voices, thought I was in trouble. When they saw a federal marshal with me, they assumed I was being arrested. Started shooting before either of us could explain. The tragedy of that moment, 2 men on the verge of finding a peaceful resolution, destroyed by loyal followers acting on incomplete information, struck Beatrice with devastating clarity. Sam McGraw had died not in a planned ambush, but as the unintended consequence of a misunderstanding. Sam tried to shield me from my own men's bullets, Morrison whispered. Died protecting the outlaw he'd been sent to capture. Last thing he said was that Emma would have liked him, that she would have wanted me to be better than what I'd become. Silas lowered his weapon, the revelation transforming his need for vengeance into something more complex and painful. So, why didn't you surrender then? Why continue the killing? Because I was a coward. Because admitting that your brother died trying to save me would have meant admitting that I'd wasted 4 years on a war that should have ended with his kindness. Instead of his death, Morrison's breathing was becoming labored, but he continued with obvious effort to complete his confession. I convinced myself that he'd been trying to trick me, that federal marshals couldn't be trusted, that the only way to honor his memory was to make sure no other lawmen could threaten my operations. But you knew better. I knew better. And every man I killed, every family I drove from their homes, every act of cruelty I commanded, all of it was just me running from the truth that your brother showed me a way to be better, and I was too afraid to take it. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the building, and Beatrice realized that Standing Bear's diversionary attack was ending. Soon, Morrison's surviving men would discover their leader's fate and decide whether to continue fighting or accept defeat. There's something else, Morrison said, his voice now barely audible. In the desk drawer, documents showing which territorial officials have been taking payments from my operations. Names, amounts, dates, everything you need to clean up the corruption that's been protecting men like me. Silas opened the indicated drawer and found a thick folder containing exactly what Morrison had described. Evidence of political corruption that reached high into the territorial government. Why? Silas asked. Why give us this? Morrison's eyes found the fallen locket, and his expression softened with what might have been peace, because Emma was right about second chances. And because maybe, if you can use that information to build something better here, my death might finally serve some purpose other than revenge. The outlaw leader's eyes closed, and his breathing grew shallow. But before consciousness left him entirely, he managed one final whisper. Tell Standing Bear. The water rights contracts are in the safe. Combination is Emma's birthday, May 15th, 1828. Silence settled over the office like dust after a storm. Morrison's chest rose and fell irregularly, but it was clear that the man who had terrorized the territory for 4 years was dying. Beatrice moved to Silas's side, placing her hand gently on his arm. The confrontation he had imagined for so long was ending not with the satisfaction of justified vengeance, but with the complex tragedy of understanding his enemy's humanity too late. I don't know what to feel, he admitted, staring down at the man who had killed his brother. I spent 4 years hating him, planning this moment. Now I find out that Sam's death was as much about bad timing and miscommunication as it was about evil intent. Does that make it hurt less? No, but it makes the hatred feel pointless, wasteful, like I've spent 4 years fighting a war that was already over. Standing Bear appeared in the doorway, his weathered face taking in the scene with the calm assessment of a man accustomed to the aftermath of violence. Behind him, 3 of his warriors waited silently. Morrison's men have surrendered, Standing Bear reported. Most of them seem relieved that their leader's reign of terror is ending. They were following him out of fear more than loyalty. What happens to them now? Those guilty of murder will face territorial justice. The others will be given the same choice your brother offered Morrison, a chance to start over somewhere, else free of their past crimes but never allowed to return to this territory. Morrison's breathing stopped as they watched, and the man who had shaped their lives through violence and loss finally found the peace that had eluded him since his sister's death decades earlier. Beatrice knelt beside the fallen locket, carefully retrieving the photograph of Emma Morrison. The young woman's gentle smile seemed to offer forgiveness for the terrible chain of events her brother's grief had set in motion. "We should bury her picture with him," she said softly. "Whatever else he became, he loved her enough to carry her." Memory through everything. As they prepared to leave Morrison's headquarters, taking with them the documents that would help clean up the territorial corruption, Beatrice realized that their victory felt different from what she had expected. There was relief, certainly, and satisfaction that the immediate threat was ended, but there was also sadness for the waste of human potential, for the lives lost to misunderstanding and fear, and for the recognition that justice was often more complicated than simple tales of good triumphing over evil suggested. The sun was high overhead as they emerged from the building, and the abandoned mining settlement seemed somehow less sinister in the full light of day. Soon it would be empty, again left to the gradual reclamation of weather and time. But the valley below, where Beatrice's inheritance waited, would be filled with new purpose and new hope, a place where the lessons learned through violence might finally serve the cause of peace. The new land deed bore both their names in careful script: Silas and Beatrice McGraw, joint owners of the property that would become the foundation of everything they planned to build together. 6 months had passed since Morrison's death, and the territory around Rocky Creek was slowly transforming from a landscape of fear into a community of hope. Beatrice stood on the porch of their newly completed ranch house, watching thunder graze peacefully in the meadow where wildflowers had begun to bloom among the rich grass. The stallion had adapted completely to mountain life, his coat gleaming with health and his spirit as magnificent as ever. "The water rights hearing went well," Silas said, joining her on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and a satisfied expression. "The territorial judge ruled in favor of our conservation proposals. No single entity will be allowed to control the headwaters ever again." It had taken months of legal work and political negotiation, but the documents they had recovered from Morrison's office had proven invaluable in exposing the corruption that had allowed criminal organizations to flourish. 3 territorial officials had resigned in disgrace, 2 others faced criminal charges, and new laws protected legitimate settlers from the kind of intimidation Morrison's gang had practiced. Standing Bear sent word that his people are ready to begin the timber harvesting partnership, Beatrice said, settling into the chair beside her husband. "They'll provide the workforce and traditional knowledge. We'll provide the equipment and access to markets. Everyone benefits." The alliance that had begun as a desperate military necessity had evolved into something more meaningful, a genuine partnership between cultures that respected each other's strengths and compensated for each other's limitations. Their ranch was becoming the center of a new kind of community, one built on cooperation rather than competition, on mutual aid rather than individual struggle. Families that Morrison's gang had driven away were returning to reclaim their homes. New settlers arrived regularly, drawn by reports of a territory where law meant protection rather than oppression. "Do you ever miss Boston?" Silas asked, a question that had become something of a ritual between them. "I miss the libraries," Beatrice admitted, "and the music, but we're planning to remedy both of those problems, aren't we?" The schoolhouse they were building would include the territory's first public library, stocked with books donated by Eastern educational institutions. And the community center would have space for musical performances and cultural events. that would bring refinement to the wilderness without sacrificing its essential character. Any regrets about choosing this life over the one you were supposed to have? Beatrice considered the question seriously, as she always did. 6 months ago, she might have been attending garden parties and charity functions in Boston, eventually marrying some suitable gentleman and settling into a life of comfortable predictability. Instead, she spent her days planning irrigation systems, negotiating with territorial officials, and learning to run a ranch that was becoming one of the most successful operations in Colorado Territory. Her hands showed calluses from real work. Her face bore the healthy tan of someone who spent time outdoors, and her spirit felt more alive than it ever had in drawing rooms and ballrooms. "No regrets," she said firmly. "This is exactly the life I was meant to live. I just needed the wilderness to show me who I really was." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their quiet conversation. A rider was coming up the valley. Trail at a steady pace, not the urgent gallop that would suggest emergency, but the purposeful movement of someone with important business to conduct. "Territorial mail," Silas observed, recognizing the rider as one of the new Postal Service employees who made regular circuits through the settled areas. The letter the rider delivered bore official seals and formal language, but its contents brought smiles to both their faces. The federal government, impressed by their success in cleaning up territorial corruption and establishing peaceful relations with local Native American tribes, was offering Silas a position as regional administrator, essentially making him responsible for law enforcement and civil administration across 3 counties. "It's everything you trained for as a federal marshal," Beatrice said, scanning the detailed job description. "A chance to build legitimate institutions instead of just fighting individual criminals. And it means we could stay here permanently, build something that lasts beyond our own lifetimes." They had talked about the possibility of such an appointment, but seeing the official offer made it real in a way that speculation never could. Silas would have the authority and resources to continue the work they had begun, creating a model of frontier governance that other territories might emulate. "There's one condition I want to add," Beatrice said, as they composed their acceptance letter that evening. "I want to serve as your official deputy, not just your wife who helps with paperwork, but a sworn law enforcement officer with full authority to act independently when necessary." The request would have scandalized most territorial officials, but times were changing, and their partnership had already proven effective beyond conventional expectations. "Federal marshals have had female deputies before," Silas said thoughtfully. "Not many, but precedent exists. And given what you've already accomplished, I can't imagine anyone questioning your qualifications." As they worked together on the correspondence that would shape their professional future, Beatrice found herself thinking about the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. The frightened heiress who had stepped off a stagecoach 6 months ago seemed like someone from another lifetime, a person she remembered fondly but could barely recognize as herself. "Do you think your father would be proud of what we've built here?" Silas asked as they sealed the letters that would determine their future. Beatrice touched the cameo brooch at her throat, her mother's brooch, which had become a talisman of the strength and grace she drew from her family heritage. "I think he would be amazed. He came here to build something lasting, but I don't think he ever imagined it would become a partnership between cultures, or that his daughter would help create a new model for how civilization could grow without destroying what was valuable." About wilderness living. Thunder nickered softly from the corral, and they could see his dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. In the distance, lights twinkled from other ranch houses and settlements, evidence of a community growing strong and stable under their protection and guidance. "What do you suppose people will say about us 50 years from now?" Beatrice asked, settling into her husband's arms as they sat on their porch overlooking the valley. Their combined efforts had transformed. "They'll say we were crazy enough to think that 2 people could make a difference in a territory full of violence and corruption," Silas replied, his voice warm with contentment. "And they'll say, 'We were right.'" The mountain night settled around. Then, with the peaceful quiet of a land where justice had finally found its footing, where love had proven stronger than hatred, and where the wilderness had revealed its capacity to nurture civilization without being destroyed by it. In the months and years that would follow, their ranch would become the nucleus of a thriving community. The library would attract scholars from Eastern universities. The timber partnership with Standing Bear's people would become a model for cooperative resource management. Young couples would come from distant territories to learn how different cultures could work together for mutual benefit. But on this particular evening, as stars wheeled overhead and the future stretched before them like an uncharted trail leading toward infinite possibility, Silas and Beatrice McGraw were content simply to hold each other and remember that sometimes the most important journeys begin with the courage to step off familiar paths and trust that love can guide even the most unlikely travelers home. Frontier had tested them both and found them worthy of its challenges. Now it was their turn to prove worthy of the peace and happiness they had fought so hard to claim.